The natal square between Mars and Jupiter represents one of the most explosive, hyper-kinetic, and pathologically overextended configurations an individual's psychic blueprint can carry. In the archetypal architecture of astrology, Mars is the localized expression of survival energy. It is the personal ego will, physical drive, cutting edge, and the instinctual momentum to conquer the immediate landscape. Jupiter, by absolute contrast, is the cosmic agent of boundless expansion, ideological conviction, risk-seeking optimism, and the relentless pursuit of an ever-receding horizon. When these two high-velocity forces lock into a tense, 90-degree structural collision, the personal will, the Mars, is permanently overcharged and weaponized by the infinite ideological hunger of Jupiter. The native does not experience assertion, anger, or momentum as a manageable, rhythmic human current. Instead, they experience every micro-action as a high-stakes, divinely sanctioned crusade for total victory. It is the archetype of the blind crusader, the reckless gambler, and the grueling lifelong mandate to transform a chronic, self-sabotaging pattern of ideological arrogance and physical exhaustion into an unshakable column of highly disciplined, strategically anchored, and master-focused evolutionary power. To comprehend the volatile internal mechanics of the Mars-square-Jupiter aspect is to examine an execution apparatus that operates on a permanent baseline of high-voltage adrenaline-seeking and hyperinflation. For the native, the subjective experience of existing within a structure or a realistic timeline is characterized by an absolute, low-grade state of existential restlessness and a profound intolerance for minor limitations. The Mars-Jupiter individual carries a profound subconscious script that equates moderation with immediate stagnation, and careful calculation with absolute cowardice. They operate under the unconscious conviction that if they slow down their pacing, check the factual data, or yield to practical boundaries, their ultimate destiny will be entirely suffocated, bypassed, or erased. Consequently, the conscious ego attempts to manage this ambient terror of obscurity by developing a hyper-aggressive operational stance, obsessively leaping into monumental enterprises long before the structural foundations are secured, over-promising on their physical capabilities, and ensuring they are always outpacing and out-risking the environment. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a highly problematic behavioral loop known as the trauma loop of ideological overextension and self-inflicted tactical fires. In their career and interpersonal relationships, Mars-square-Jupiter individuals are intensely prone to developing extreme all-or-nothing action patterns centered around the absolute conviction of their own rightness. Because their nervous system associates the high-friction rush of grand gambles and moral crusades with authentic vital power, they do not know how to operate in a calm, cooperative, or low-stakes environment. To relieve the internal pressure of a stabilizing environment that threatens to ground them, the native will instinctively deploy calculated acts of sudden, aggressive expansion, manifesting as reckless competitive overreach, sweeping ideological ultimatums, or sudden, massive financial bets that shock their peers. They intentionally push situations to the absolute edge of a physical or financial cliff to feel safe, fully convinced that they are only secure when they are actively breaking through a boundary or conquering a seemingly impossible peak. The roots of this profound psychological dislocation are invariably traced back to an early childhood environment defined by intense pressure to perform, an ambient exposure to an unstable family matrix that alternated violently between grandiose promises and sudden structural collapses, or a severe suppression of the child's raw vitality that forced them to overcompensate through absolute exceptionalism. The child hosting this conjunction was typically raised in an environment where parental validation or basic survival was explicitly tied to outward victory, being the absolute best, or defending a dogmatic family ideology against an imagined hostile world. A primary caregiver may have utilized sophisticated mechanisms of intense philosophical pressure, or perhaps their own unfulfilled, volcanic ambitions were directly projected onto the child, forcing them to conclude that being ordinary is a sin. The child internalized a devastating, foundational lesson: to build something slowly is to court failure, and to survive, you must be prepared to be more relentless, more daring, and more ideologically unyielding than anyone else in the arena. Energetically and physically, hosting this molten, hyper-amplified friction places an immense, exhausting strain on the individual's physical vehicle. Mars rules the blood, the muscles, acute inflammatory responses, and the adrenal glands, while Jupiter rules the liver, arterial circulation, cellular expansion, and fat metabolism. When these two forces collide in a tense square, the physical body becomes a literal pressure cooker for the unexpressed, radioactive desires of the soul. These individuals live with an extreme degree of somatic armoring, unconsciously holding massive amounts of survival tension and kinetic heat in their solar plexus, thighs, and jaw. This constant state of physiological emergency manifests over time as acute adrenal burnout, sudden and explosive endocrine surges, severe muscular tears or repetitive strain injuries, or sudden, volatile inflammatory surges that flare up overnight whenever their grand ambitions are relationally or professionally blocked. The physical tissue accurately mirrors the mind's internal state through acute physical overexertion, as the body literally runs on a continuous loop of high-voltage survival and conquest signaling. Yet, the ultimate evolutionary architecture of the Mars-square-Jupiter aspect is not designed to permanently traumatize, exhaust, or condemn the native to a lifetime of lonely, volatile burnout. It is the elite training ground for the supreme master of material execution and authentic visionary power. The universe deliberately starves these individuals of unearned luck and easy, conventional victories so that they are forced to dismantle their codependent reliance on reckless impulse and discover an unshakable, self-generated internal sovereignty. The cosmos subjects them to endless metaphorical crashes, devastating betrayals of their own blind optimism, and self-inflicted tactical catastrophes not to destroy them, but to burn away every single drop of their infantile egoic entitlement, manipulative arrogance, and regressive attachment to chaotic ambition. They are being systematically re-engineered into the ultimate visionaries, pioneers, and crisis anchors of the collective, individuals who can pioneer entirely new paradigms of action, create monumental creative enterprises, or champion alternative paths because they have learned how to hold the absolute fullness of their passion without weaponizing it against reality. The supreme liberation for this placement requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic and psychological surrender. The native must learn the supreme courage of staying in the room and allowing their aggressive control and expansion mechanisms to be entirely dismantled without launching a frantic counter-assault for more. The agonizing, repeating cycle of intense obsession, toxic confrontation, and catastrophic behavioral destruction will never cease until the individual undergoes a profound shift in consciousness, realizing that the predatory, insatiable monster they are chasing or fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the projection of their own unintegrated Jupiterian desire attempting to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own defensive armor. They must learn to tolerate the immense vulnerability of a gradual, consistent expansion, allowing themselves to feel the terrifying weight of consistent care and slow building without interpreting that lack of immediate fireworks or administrative chaos as creative or emotional death. They must undergo a total death of the defensive, predator ego, willingly dropping their sharp, hyper-focused tracking tactics, sitting completely exposed in the raw wreckage of their broken ambitions, and discovering that when everything they used to conquer the environment is stripped away, their core capacity to act, regenerate, and empower remains completely untouched. When a Mars-square Jupiter native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a hyper-vigilant, self-sabotaging survivalist into a sovereign master of concentrated evolutionary force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The heavy, armor-plated ego shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly, creative, and psychological authority. Having sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal desire warfare, stared directly into the absolute bottom of the psychological abyss of emptiness, and survived the total annihilation of their infantile needs for superficial luck, they possess an unmatched, terrifying stamina. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the emotional manipulations, false promises, and psychological intimidation tactics of lesser minds. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master systemic strategists, and profound creative forces, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, collapsing, and toxic environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of human shadow and structural collapse on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, To descend beneath the outermost behavioral armor of the Jupiter square Mars configuration is to expose an execution apparatus operating like a high-performance engine wired directly into a massive, unmetered nitrous oxide tank, permanently redlining, generating immense volcanic friction, and structurally braced for absolute systemic overreach. While the external presentation of this native often commands deep fascination for its boundary-shattering charisma, its towering, larger-than-life competitive stamina, and its unblinking capacity to launch monumental creative or professional enterprises, a clinical descent into its core reveals a darker, more exhausting operational reality. The psyche runs a permanent, non-negotiable background script that decodes calculated pacing, administrative moderation, and ordinary human boundaries as an existential threat of immediate castration or total erasure. Mars is the instinctual organism that seeks to execute targeted, deliberate action within the linear constraints of time and energy. Jupiter is the absolute, transpersonal law of boundless expansion, ideological righteousness, and cosmic entitlement that demands the immediate elimination of any structural perimeter. The square locks these two high-velocity principles into a perpetual 90-degree structural collision, forcing the native to spend decades living with a nervous system that registers a smooth, steady trajectory or a realistic project timeline not as a sustainable sanctuary, but as a living tomb designed to suffocate their fire and dilute their grand destiny. The most profound, insidious pathology of this configuration is a phenomenon that can be clinically termed the grand delusion of infinite somatic endurance. Because the natives' early environment taught them that safety, validation, and love are never granted freely but must be aggressively captured through extraordinary, exceptionalist performance, they develop an absolute intolerance for authentic energetic stillness. A Jupiter square Mars individual cannot simply complete a task, manage a routine workload, or surrender to the quiet, rhythmic pacing of everyday progress. Their mind functions as an existential scale simulator, obsessively amplifying every localized objective, competitive threat, or creative impulse into a high-stakes, divinely sanctioned crusade. If a situation is genuinely low friction and accessible, the native experiences an acute, terrifying disorientation. The very ease of the enterprise feels like a deceptive trap designed to lull them into an evolutionary sleep before their momentum is permanently broken. To relieve this internal panic, they will instinctively deploy calculated, subconscious disruptions, manifesting as the immediate overcommitment to impossible timelines, the reckless accumulation of competing obligations, or the sudden, aggressive escalation of a mild disagreement into an ideological war of attrition. They must intentionally push their operation to the absolute edge of a systemic cliff to feel alive, fully convinced that their power is only genuine when it is actively overcoming maximum resistance. This permanent internal mobilization breeds a highly problematic behavioral mechanism known as the preemptive eviction through ideological totalism. Because these individuals carry a cellular memory of deep vulnerability resulting from early environmental instability or the crushing suppression of their raw vitality, they live in a state of chronic defensive countermobility. If they sense that a project is requiring them to slow down, collaborate horizontally, or submit their methods to rigorous external metrics, the Jupiter-Mars current instantly shifts their nervous system from an cooperative footing to an unyielding, evangelical posture of absolute rightness. Rather than communicating their tender underlying fear of failure or their profound sense of inadequacy when measured against realistic human standards, which their fierce, hyper-independent ego structure views as an act of absolute, humiliating regression, they launch devastatingly loud, overconfident, and completely disproportionate tactical expansion campaigns. They will ghost an intimate or professional alliance the moment a conversation veers into routine, pragmatic compromise, look at an analytically disciplined peer with absolute, condescending ideological detachment, or intentionally burn down a highly viable enterprise through a sudden, reckless financial or strategic gamble rather than admit their initial blueprint was flawed. This tactical ruthlessness routinely creates the exact catastrophe they dread. They inadvertently alienate their primary allies, exhaust their financial resources, and fracture the very foundations of long-term material stability they spend their life trying to build. Furthermore, this aspect creates an exceptionally dangerous, almost addictive relationship with the archetype of the impossible conquest. The Jupiter square Mars native possesses an absolute, deep-seated contempt for anything that feels soft, easily accessible, or inherently safe in the physical, creative, or romantic realm. They suffer from an ambient guilt whenever life is fluid and effortlessly sustainable, viewing ordinary comfort and pragmatic execution as a dangerous sedative that dulls their evolutionary edge. To cure this anxiety, they are repeatedly drawn to highly volatile, pathologically demanding, or inherently unviable endeavors, projects that must be constructed out of thin air under impossible stress, competitive landscapes that require radical opposition to established institutional powers, or dynamics that can only exist in explosive, dramatic bursts of mutual over-idealization. They seek out conditions that embody the sharp, unyielding friction of the square, forces that demand they function as an unbreakable machine of absolute, heroic willpower, executing tasks while expecting the rules of human exhaustion and physical gravity to magically bend around them. To the twisted, survivalist calculus of this configuration, enduring the elegant torment of a permanent upward climb, surviving the grueling agony of a self-inflicted tactical fire, and living in the pristine isolation of a perpetual battle is the only authentic state of connection, leading them to view a peaceful, stable, and healthy trajectory not as a sanctuary, but as an uninspiring, dead-end prison. On a genetic and karmic level, this square indicates that the individual has been appointed as the absolute executioner of a bloodline's unvetted financial collapses, reckless gambles, and ancestral outcasts who were destroyed by their own blind arrogance or crushed under the boot of rigid religious or legal dogmatism. They inherit a cellular matrix choked by generations of ancestors who survived through the severe, toxic suppression of their true ambition, or who conversely ruined their family lineage through spectacular acts of reckless, overextended bravado, leaving behind an unresolved karmic debt buried in the tissue as an ambient curse of chronic overcompensation. The native does not just carry personal stress, they carry the compacted, radioactive trauma weight of 100 dead radicals, failed entrepreneurs, and religious crusaders who lived with their anger and desire buried in the dark, dying with their weapons still clutched in their hands while charging an impossible fortress. Their psychic atmosphere feels heavy and serious because they are the designated circuit breaker who must choose either to consciously face, contain, and alchemize this volatile ancestral inheritance, or let it repeat its destructive cycle by physically and neurotically fracturing their own lives, careers, and somatic health. The ultimate evolutionary liberation for the Jupiter square Mars native requires a radical, terrifying act of somatic and psychological capitulation. They must learn the supreme courage of allowing their aggressive expansion and control armor to be entirely dismantled without launching a frantic counter-assault for more space. The agonizing, repeating cycle of intense obsession, toxic overextension, and catastrophic romantic or professional destruction will never cease until the individual undergoes a profound shift in consciousness, realizing that the predatory, insatiable monster they are chasing or fighting so viciously in the outside world is actually the projection of their own unintegrated Jupiterian desire attempting to break them out of the suffocating tomb of their own defensive armor. They must learn to tolerate the immense vulnerability of stillness, allowing themselves to feel the terrifying weight of consistent care, gradual building, and realistic boundaries without interpreting that lack of immediate fireworks or administrative chaos as emotional or creative death. They must undergo a total death of the detached, hyper-independent predator ego, willingly letting their defensive escape mechanisms drop, embracing the raw, trembling grief of their early childhood performance pressure, and learning to anchor their immense, innovative passion within a core of deep, unshakable somatic presence and authentic self-mastery. When a Jupiter square Mars native finally alchemizes this aspect, shifting from a hyper-reactive, self-sabotaging disruptor into a sovereign master of concentrated visionary force, a magnificent transfiguration occurs. The cold, armor-plated ego shell dissolves, leaving behind an unbreakable, magnetic pillar of pure worldly, creative, and charismatic authority. Having sat in the absolute hottest furnaces of internal desire warfare, mastered the terrifying vacuum of their own existential restlessness, and survived the total annihilation of their infantile needs for superficial victory and unearned luck, they possess an unmatched, terrifying clarity. They emerge into the world entirely immune to the emotional manipulations, false promises, and psychological intimidation tactics of lesser minds. They become the ultimate crisis anchors, master systemic strategists, and profound creative forces, individuals who can walk completely unafraid into the most chaotic, collapsing, and restrictive human environments on Earth, hold the entire weight of human vision and physical execution on their shoulders with an unblinking, majestic composure, and manifest monumental healing, art, and societal infrastructure because their willpower was forged in the absolute zero of integrated freedom, practical discipline, and ultimate self-mastery. Subscribe, like, and share.